I do have a little word to share with you, and I'm going to talk to you after everyone's done about my experience with the March on Washington. But this poem was read by a wife of one of my colleagues who did not make it out of the North Tower in 2001. In tribute to him, his wife read this poem by Shel Silverstein. Someone has to go polish the stars. They're looking a little bit dull. Someone has to go polish the stars for the angels, the eagles, and starlings and gulls. They've all been complaining that they're tarnished and worn. They say they want new ones we cannot afford. So please get your rags and your polishing jars. Someone has to go polish the stars. We know that many people left us very abruptly on 9/11. And in her tribute to her husband, she saw him as being called to go polish the stars, as being chosen to do that. And I think we all may have someone we lost or we can think about who left all too soon. But if we think about them as being up there polishing the stars, then that might give us something to look up to on a dark, starry night. So I'm going to ask Jan if she might give us a little feedback on the group discussion in her breakout room. Jan?
Natalie, thank you for that beautiful poem. And I'm going to treasure that moment. Thank you for sharing that. It was a spectacular group that shared a great deal. And what I thought was fascinating is that we had what I was calling our international group. We have someone who wasn't born in the country and is from Europe, and I have had two West Coast people, which is another country when you live on the East Coast in New York. And I'm not sure where and then we had another New Yorker. There were themes and not a particular story, but some really delicious themes that I was hearing again and again. Everyone spoke about values becoming clearer and the difference in people's values. So one person talked about how he started to see after 9/11 people's true colors, that you started to see what people really stood for or didn't. And that he had, when he first came to this country, he was told not to talk politics and religion, but that now he feels that now is the time to absolutely talk politics and religion, and really gave an impassioned plea for us to be having these conversations, because it's where we'll find solidarity and where we'll take action. Two of our people were young teens, and they talked about being on the West Coast and waking up to seeing the crash and not knowing what was going on. And one lived in San Diego, a military town, so children were very afraid for their parents and acting. Both women talked about the fear that they felt as young people, but also felt a national cohesion around the flag and patriotism and we're Americans strong and proud. And for both those people and for basically all of us in the group, we were reflecting on how the symbol of the American flag has been tarnished for us, to use the Shel Silverstein image. Not that I avoid the, anyway, I've got 6 thoughts about that. I'm gonna table those. So anyway, the American flag now is no longer something we rally about, and that it's actually divisional, it's divisive. We talked about there being a loss of innocence and the sadness of that. Like a child losing innocence, there were many of us who felt that there was a basic goodness in people, a basic goodness yet unrealized in this country, and felt that over time in these 19 years, we're feeling less and less of that. and uh, and then a heightened understanding of how deep white supremacy runs in this country, and that knowledge is, this is my feeling, I'm hoping that knowledge is power, and where hatred is power, that this knowledge and this coming together will give us the power to get us back on a good, not back, we get us on a good course. That's the high level view.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much,
You're
Jan.
welcome.
Oh, I appreciate that. That was really great dialogue in that group. You had a lot of great points to share. Dr. Clifton, did you facilitate? And
Dr. Clifton, if you could unmute yourself.
Yes, I facilitated, but I also thought we all facilitated each other. We had a good group, starting off by each body sharing where they were and their feelings of that day. Two of the people were very connected to New York, but weren't in it. One was in Canada and one was in California, in search of some missing people. They were all found. One of the people had their first job interview in America that morning, and I was in the city looking for my daughters who were fine, and spent the day watching people in ashes walk up First Avenue for hours and hours. It felt like a scene from Dante's Inferno. And then we talked about, oftentimes we see a backlash of wanting to find who's responsible for this chaos and this tragedy, and we start to find blame and take it out on people, and that seems to go with tragedy, and and with that there's blame, and they don't look at themselves either. But we also had shared stories of wonderful compassion and loving kindness that people would give to each other after a tragedy. Americans have a good way of doing it, but we also have an underlying tendency to we discussed that to fabricate causalities of certain things. What our motives were for all our wars and all our bombs, and we sort of believe that, and we tend to forget that the Constitution was based on only men voting and only people who own land voting for many years. And that was set up to control a lot of people. So that discussion was interesting. And then it led to the point where how we can, hold our history, understand it, but also, transcend it. And then we talked about, several people talked about their experience before the 9/11 of experiences a strange sense of weirdness anytime they were in this building. And we recalled that there was right near there was a cemetery found, excavated for slaves, and there was a cemetery for Native Americans. So maybe that's some of the weirdness within it. Not in any way saying that was the cause of the tragedy. So it was a really lively and deep discussion that I always appreciate. So that's
wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Clifton. Nalini, do you want to share?
Yes. So we had a really interesting, really fascinating discussion. First of all, we had a tremendous amount of diversity in our group, and it made me think that following 9/11, I remember reading that it felt like this was a failure of our imagination, that this could even happen, that we could be so hated, that someone, a group of people, many people could harbor so much hatred towards us. And what my group seemed to really feel strongly about was, if only we traveled more, if only we experienced the world through the eyes of people in different parts of the world, if only we were sensitive to what we ourselves are inflicting upon the rest of the world, or how we are influencing or affecting the rest of the world, and if only we saw things from others' perspectives, this would not have been such a failure of our imagination. And specifically, we had some really interesting stories. One was from one of our group members who was in the Dominican Republic at that time. And she shared that when she was returning to the U.S. in need of a second surgery, she was receiving extra hate, an extra sense of hate. Basically, the idea was you Hispanics are here to take up and use up our medical insurance. And that was new and newer following 9/11 that she was being targeted for that. We had the opposite example from a gentleman who is an immigrant from Africa who had married an African American woman. And he shared that following 9/11, he could go to the airport and he was treated so nicely, nicer than he had ever been treated before, because either he was being seen as white or, sadly, as, oh, well, he is, in his words, a lazy black man, so therefore he can't be a bad terrorist. And he thought, well, hey, this is what it's like to be treated nicely. Maybe I'll take this over how I was treated before 9/11. That was a really fascinating story. And then we had an example from a member who joined us who was in Cameroon at the time. And we don't always think of 9/11 and Cameroon in the same sentence, but her experience of food insecurity and corporal punishment and the impact of global colonialism and the devastating impact that had. And it was very interesting to hear her experience from that, which was very different from the narrative that I would use as a New Yorker, describing what happened on 9/11 and the impact of it. That was really interesting. And we had a comment that was echoing what our opening speaker, Alok, had shared, that following 9/11, people who were literally my complexion were being targeted, whether it was for wearing a bindi, a dot. There were dot busters, that's what they called themselves, the gangs in New Jersey who were going around and shooting women who looked just like me, who were wearing bindis or not wearing bindis, but just who happened to look like this. And there were Sikh men or Sardars in turbans who were also being attacked. I think we've all read about this. And with complete ignorance turned to hatred. And an interesting point was made that throughout our history, it seems that we've chosen that as part of our identity, our identity always points to something else as an other, that we've had to choose some group to hate, whether it is one group or another over time, whether it was the Native Americans, our indigenous people, whether it happened to be the Japanese or the Chinese at some point, whether it happened to be South Asians, whether it happened to be East Asians. I mean, it's just mind-boggling that we've developed an identity as us versus them, and that has been such a big part of our story. And wouldn't it be so wonderful in this pandemic time that we're all locked up at home, that we're all connecting via the same technology? Can't we use this time to reflect and try to find a way to experience the oneness of this shared experience, the oneness of our shared social fabric, and reach out and hold hands, as opposed to seeing that otherness? And so that was our group.
Excellent. Mrs. Faley. Is she unmuted?
Okay. Well, I'll go to the view of the Canadian who was in a small, white, isolated community in Canada. And so the experience was just so totally different there. She brought up the fact that in Newfoundland, people in Newfoundland were taking people in to help them. And the play Come From Away was about that. And it sort of brought up the idea, it brought up the idea that that's how community is created. It doesn't matter who ends up in need, but when they're in need. And she was saying, well, Canadians do that. And I think Americans do that too. They just need to be given the opportunity to do that. And those who are on the outside blaming others to be brought in some way. But that was a beautiful, experience that I had never thought about. I brought in my experience of being at Ward Mobile High School, um, and trying to keep the students in the classroom, trying to figure out what was going on, not knowing where my husband was, because I thought he had gone off to the city. He hadn't. And it was chaos, it was chaos. And it was my first reaction to the pandemic too. And each time things get a little worse, it seems chaotic. And what do you do? And when one person, said, well, because I'm white, I feel very guilty. And then the comment was, well, guilt leads to an awareness of healing. That yes, I feel guilty. Why do I feel guilty, and where do I go with this? Okay, I'm fortunate, and I can move forward in that knowledge. And I guess the most important thing is being aware. And we talked about this in another session, of being aware of who we are and where you are, and accepting that, and then moving forward. And I think that self-knowledge is really important for personal healing and the healing within the community. Being able to verbalize that in a positive way. The idea that I like the statement that relationships are the costumes we wear. I thought that was rather interesting. And that love is universal. The first person mentioned that it really changed her life, that they decided that it was best to be in a place where they didn't have to travel as much, that travel does take the family apart. And before 9/11, we, thought of it as, oh, well, there's no chance of difficult things happening. But 9/11 made us aware that there are some great difficulties with traveling frequently, and that the family is really important, and it's important to stay together as a family. So it was a really lively discussion on it was great to have this today.
Yes.
Because it was treated by the media as very somber, very sad. It's an experience, it's a loss, and this forum gives us an opportunity to discuss it in a very personal and beautiful way, lively way.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. I think we can all agree that everything shared has been so meaningful. Well, I was in a group with some amazing people too, who had varied experiences on 9/11 that they reflected on. The first person really ended up with talking about the trauma that continues to stay with her in terms of a flashback. So when you hear a siren, when you hear helicopters, those feelings reemerge. And we don't really think about feelings like that. And sometimes we react without connecting it to, how did this start? Why am I feeling this way? Sometimes she shared that she's not even really sure if she's heard a siren that was actually happening, or whether it was something that she was recalling. And as that young lady was speaking, I told her that I could actually see her visibly change when she started to talk about and put the dots together in terms of what she felt then and how she was feeling now. In another sense, there was a young lady in our group who was in the second grade when this happened. And at that young age, she was with a grandmother for most of the day, because otherwise she was in school, heard the announcement, and everything sounded and felt normal because she really didn't understand what was happening. But back at home, her mother didn't get home until like 11 o'clock at night, and she was with a grandmother who didn't speak English. And they were watching these images on TV, not really understanding what was going on. But in her journey through, looking back then and looking now, we want to really understand why we're in turmoil as a nation, and why our disappointment ends up being the way that we treat people. And so there was reflection on, okay, well, we were in the situation, and then while we were all together, it was great, but then we needed to assign blame to a group of people. We began to be very hateful in the way we were reacting to people. And so there's a disappointment about the way people are treated and reflection on how we are seeing Black Lives Matters being embraced or not in this time. We feel despair, and as a nation, we can come together. We have a singleness of thought, and with the pandemic, we were worried about dying. We were worried about our mortality. With 9/11, this was terrible. Our whole nation was attacked, and we had this sense of despair. But out of that came hatred, or came acts that were unkind and targeting of groups of people. We saw it then with people who were of Indian descent or looked like they were from other countries that were not the same. We see, and our opening speaker talked about the Asian Americans who were treated and pointed out after crisis. What we haven't realized as a country is that there's room for everyone. And out of crisis should come healing, cohesive healing, not blame. And I love that Dr. Clifton pointed out this motives of fabricating causality. I think that's what he said. Looking for someone else to blame. While our values become clearer and there's a rise in patriotism, there's also a desire to assign blame. I think we will only really heal when we can come together and stay together. So the question was, where were we when this happened and where were we now? And it definitely is not just a question about where you were physically, but maybe where you were emotionally, maybe where you were on your convictions, and where are you now? How has what happened in the past influenced you? How have things stayed with you? And what do you see for the future? I just want to take a few minutes because all of this is wrapped into the way we're feeling and all of the events that we're experiencing around us. A week ago, I had the opportunity to go to the March on Washington. This was the 57th year, celebrating, I don't know if celebrating is a good word, because the march really originated in 1963. And it was a march that was demanding jobs, demanding that people of African descent be treated just the way the Constitution said. Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech was first heard at that march on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And he said that America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has been marked and returned as insufficient funds. We've not been treated the way the Constitution promised. On August 28th, families of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Eric Garner, Jacob Blake, and so many other families echoed the need to address the dysfunction in the treatment of people of color by people in authority. The main focus of the march was not jobs as it was 57 years ago, but 50,000 people who were impassioned about what they're seeing as this constant pandemic on its own, came together to say, get your knee off of our necks. We are committed to changing the way social justice doesn't work for people of color. And so you had survivors of the Parkland school shooting in Florida. You had Jacob Blake Sr. telling us that his son was shackled to the bed by authorities, even though he's paralyzed, and even though he was the person who injustice was rendered to. Breonna Taylor's mother asked the crowd just to say her name because they're working to get Breonna's law passed. The sister of Botham Jean the man who was shot by an officer while he was at home eating ice cream on his couch, told us that she was attending the event because she believes police brutality is the largest killer of Black and brown people. And the granddaughter of Martin Luther King said, "Show me what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like." Almost 50,000 people gathered to say, we don't want this to continue anymore. And I just think at this time, our nation really needs to understand that there's room for everyone. That if we are pointing out that something's wrong, we're doing it with the best of intentions. We want to live in harmony. We want to be able to come together, but we can't do that if members or groups are allowed to act differently. We have to be big enough to understand where dysfunction is. In the words of John Lewis, ordinary people with extraordinary vision can redeem the soul of America by getting into good trouble. This should be our highest calling at heart, just to do the right thing. And if we believe that in our hearts, then it really is time for us to let freedom ring, to not be afraid to speak, to let our voices be heard. Thank you.
Thank you.